Welcome to Chapter 15, which covers Darwin's theory of evolution. This is something that many of you have heard in other science classes. You've kind of talked about this idea of survival of the fittest, that type of thing. So in these first two sections, we're going to cover sections 1 and 2 in these video notes. We're going to kind of look at where did this all start? How does all of this information that we currently know about evolution, where did we get that from? The objectives for these two sections include, number 1, understand Charles Darwin's contributions to science, be able to describe the pattern that he observed when he was on the Galapagos Islands, and identify how current scientific knowledge influenced Darwin in his voyage. By the end of this, you should be able to describe what a theory is, discuss evolution, and this idea of fossils. So let's look at who Charles Darwin is. Charles Darwin lived from 1809 to 1882. He was born in England, and he had a lot of influences in his early life. Both his father and his grandfather were doctors, and they really pushed Charles to become a doctor, but he wasn't as interested in that as he was in other things. His grandfather actually was one of the first to introduce the idea of species changing over time, and that influenced Charles. He became interested in that, and he was able to kind of talk with his grandfather, get a lot of good ideas, background information, that type of thing. Robert Grant was his professor at med school and was also a naturalist. And he kind of mentored Darwin and got him started on this kind of track. Some other influences in the current scientific thinking during Charles Darwin times included James Hutton, and he was the one that kind of really looked at all the different geological processes and looking at how rock formations are formed and how they are broken down. And what he kind of figured out is that these different processes can take millions of years to occur. So from the time of all these rocks that are buried deep within the Earth's surface, or beneath the surface, and how they're moved upwards to form mountain ranges, that types of things take millions of years. And therefore, the Earth must be a lot older than it was currently thought. So this idea that the Earth was not that old, he was the one that kind of said, you know, if we look at the geological side of this, that's not necessarily the case. The other individual, Charles Lyell, was a good friend of Darwin, and he presented this idea of uniformitarianism, which states that the physical features of Earth were not created in their present form, but are the result of long periods of uplift, erosion, and volcanism. So he kind of built on this idea of Hutton's geological change. Darwin was actually lucky enough to witness one of these geological changes where there was an earthquake, and he was able to see how much the landscape changed with that realization. And because he kind of had this idea of, oh, these geological processes can take millions of years and things change over time, began to ask himself, okay, so what is true then about living things? Can those kind of change over time? And if it takes millions of years possibly for geological things to change, how long might it take for other organisms to change? Other things going on, Thomas Malthus, he was the one that kind of brought on this idea of the carrying capacity of a specific environment. Now, this goes back to earlier in the year where we look at the resources that are available for different species and how much the environment can actually hold. And Malthus reasoned that if the human population kind of continued to grow unchecked, sooner or later there would be insufficient living space and food for everyone. Charles Darwin kind of looked at that, realizing that could this be applied to plants and animals? Thinking about how plants and animals are going to reproduce more rapidly than humans currently do, and then applying that to how the animals or plants might evolve. The last one kind of on the list is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he was one of the first scientists to recognize that living things changed over time and adapted to their environments. And he had three main tenets. One, the tendency towards perfection. And this went around this idea that all organisms have this innate tendency towards being perfect. So birds, this kind of relates to the birds were able to fly because they kept trying to. So they kept trying to, like the ancestors of birds really wanted to fly. So they kept trying, and over time they were able to get the specific features of wings and whatnot to allow them to fly. Lamarck also had this idea of use and disuse. Basically, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. So birds could kind of transform their front wings into wings if they actually use them enough. Or other animals that maybe had wings but then didn't necessarily use them, at some point those wings would become useless and possibly disappear. And the last piece of this is inheritance of acquired traits. So different traits of things that have been kind of acquired, those would get passed on to the offspring. So like if a bird somehow altered its structure for its wings per se to make them more usable, then these actual alterations would be kind of passed down to another. And we'll kind of explain a little bit more of this moving forward. But this gives you an idea of where was the current scientific thinking before Darwin, or during the time of Darwin when he was starting to think about this and before he left on his voyage. So now let's talk a little bit about the actual voyage. So this was kind of a trip of a lifetime. Darwin was hired as basically a companion to the naturalist that was already on board, to the HMS Beagle, who was captained by Robert Fitzroy. And eventually Darwin took over as the naturalist because he knew more than the current naturalist. So he had a lot of background kind of in this biology and being a naturalist. And so he was actually able to kind of take over that role. The HMS Beagle was actually named for His Majesty's ship, and it was from the British Navy. And this trip was actually the second voyage of the Beagle. They set sail on 1831. You can kind of see here the route that they took. So they sailed from England and returned after its voyage around the world in 1836. So they ranged about 5 years. So they left in 1831, came back in 1836. So you can kind of see here they started off in England. They went down along the coast of South America up to the Galapagos Islands, which we'll talk more in detail about, around Tahiti, and then back through Australia, through Africa, and then back up there. So you can kind of get an idea of how much of the world Darwin was able to see and observe. And these are some of the things that he was able to see. Darwin noticed that so many plants and animals seemed so well suited for the particular environment that they lived in. And he wondered if was there a process to this. And when we look at where he traveled, he began to kind of think, wait, why are certain animals only found in a particular area? Like, why does Australia not have any rabbits? Why are kangaroos not found all over the world? So what he was able to look at is looking at the different environments and kind of trying to understand, okay, well, if there are similar environments, why don't we see all of those same animals? So like on Australia, an area that would be really good for rabbits, how come there are no rabbits there? So these are the questions he started to ask himself. He also looked at living organisms and fossils. So fossils are the preserved remains of ancient organisms, and he was able to find different fossils and analyze them. He made comparisons to the fossils they found with the current species he was finding. And this was kind of key because he was able to see how they were similar, but also the different variety as well. And he wondered what could have been the change for this. So on this whole voyage, he was literally gathering up different specimens and bringing them onto the ship and really analyzing them. The key came from when he looked at the Galapagos Islands. Darwin noticed that on different islands there were different species of tortoises. Each were adapted to the food source that were available on the island. On Hoodla Island, they had a long neck. It was reaching the sparse vegetation because Hood Island had a lot rougher conditions, not as much vegetation there. While Isabella Island, the tortoise there had a short neck and had large amounts of because there was large amounts of vegetation, and therefore it was easier to access the different food. So if we look at Isabella Island, where we have a little bit different build, a shorter neck, kind of a little bit shorter legs here, and the shell itself. Versus on Hoodla Island, where there's not as much vegetation, we notice a pretty distinct difference between the two. And this is kind of all the information that Darwin started to pull together and then begun to analyze, and again asking those questions as to why is this the case? If I compare the fossil records, how do those records compare to the current species on here? So this kind of got all of this kind of background information necessary for Darwin's theory of evolution, which we will get into in section 15-3 and talk about how did he pull all this information into what we now know today.